This is the Compass Podcast, where we disrupt the everyday with a glimpse of the divine. My name is Michelle Maldonado.
And I'm Ryan Dunn.
Ryan, what do we have for this episode?
We're talking diversity, inclusion, integration, hope, and divine intervention with John Blake. And John has a really interesting backstory, as he's the child of a black father and white mother who really he did not know whether or not his mother existed throughout his formative years. And even John's father was kind of in and out of his life during his childhood. So John has some interesting stories to tell about family and relationships, including his relationship with the church. And if you're wondering why the name John Blake is familiar, it's because John is an award-winning journalist for CNN.com. In his 2020 essay called "There's One Epidemic We May Never Find a Cure For, Fear of Black Men in Public Spaces," that was recently selected by Bustle Digital Group as one of the 11 best essays on racism and police violence. John is a Baltimore native living in Atlanta, and his book that just hit the proverbial shelves is called "More Than I Imagined," which actually prompted our conversation with John.
This was such a great conversation I had with John. He touched on a lot of great topics, so I'm really looking forward to sharing that conversation with him.
John Blake, thank you so much for joining us, first of all. I hope you're doing well today.
Thank you. I am.
Good. So you've been living your life story for a couple of decades now, we'll say, and what prompted you to share your story now? Where did your book come from?
The idea for the book started when I went back to my hometown in Baltimore in 2015 to cover these violent protests. Some people call it a race riot, some people call it an uprising, but a lot of people know it as a Freddie Gray riot/uprising. And those protests literally took place where I grew up. So it was a very strange experience to go back to my own neighborhood and to see it literally go up in flames because of racism. And so while I was there, I was struck by this contrast. I'm here going back to my hometown and I'm seeing it come apart because of racism. But with my personal life, I'm seeing the white and black members of my family come together despite racism. So I was trying to figure out, why were these divisions in my family melting away when in our country they seem to get deeper and deeper? So I was trying to kind of answer that mystery. That's part of the reason I wrote it. And secondly, as a journalist, I've been covering race for about 25 years. So I've been in the thick of some of the most painful racial episodes in this country's history. And I've always said to myself, I am so tired of writing about racial divisions. And I want to write a story that shows us a way of getting past those divisions. And so later in my life, I realized, wait a minute, I'm living such a story. And this is worth sharing with people.
And we probably need to name that for much of your life, you were estranged from the white side of your family. Were you able to get the story from them? If there were events happening at that time that really kind of opened up an awareness for them of moving closer towards you or opening a deeper relationship with you?
No, I mean, the white side of my family didn't exist for me for the first 17 years of my life. They rejected me and my brother when we were born. So when I grew up, the black side of my family told me was this: your mother's name is Shirley, she's white, and her family hates black people. That's all I knew. So I grew up in this all black world in this inner city neighborhood in Baltimore where everybody seemed to hate white people. And so I had no awareness of their existence. I didn't know if my mother was alive. I didn't know what she looked like, the sound of her voice, or anything. It's like what I said in the book. I said I came into the world with half of my identity amputated. So I had no clue to their existence. They had made no effort to contact me. And then suddenly at 17, not long before I'm on my way to college, my father comes to me and said, "Hey, do you want to meet your mother?" So it was like he dropped the bomb on me. I'm like, whoa. And that's when it started, when I met my mom and then meeting her, and I began to meet other members of my white family. And that's when I had to figure out how do you become a family when you know this side of yourself, that they rejected you.
Wow, that's a lot for a teenager dealing with already so many things in general, and then that bomb being dropped. Like, wow.
Yeah, because when I was born in the mid-'60s, interracial marriage was illegal. There was no Obama, there's no Kamala Harris, there's no Jordan Peele, there were no role models. So where I grew up, it was a mark of shame to have a white mom. That's why I say I grew up in my world is what I call a closeted biracial person. I didn't let any of my friends know that my mom was white. It was a source of shame. And so that in itself was enough to deal with. And then to suddenly at 17 say, okay, you got to meet your mom and you have to learn how to be close to these people who I thought hated me. Yeah, I that was a very surreal experience when I first met her.
So in your childhood and youth, church was not a happy or willing choice. At what point did that change and how?
In my childhood, you're right, it was not a happy choice. I didn't decide to attend church. I was drafted, by a lot of kids. But it also gave me glimmers of another world, of another way. So it wasn't all bad. But church really proved decisive for me in college. And that is right after I met my mom. So suddenly I have to find a way to connect with her and the white members of my family. And I had all this hostility toward white people. One, because I knew this white side of my family rejected me. And two, because of where I grew up. Nobody liked white people. We hardly ever saw them. So I had to find a way to get over that hostility and find a way to learn how to see white people as just fellow human beings. Church was crucial because when I joined this church in college, I didn't know it at the time. I just joined because some friends had reached out to me. I went to a black college in DC called Howard University. But I didn't know it, but the church I had joined was at the forefront of an interracial movement. It was an interracial church when it was not so cool and very rare. So when I joined church, it was the first time I began to see white people as friends, and I formed friendships with them. And that was key. That was like, it showed me another way to really connect with white people. And words like forgiveness and showing grace to people, that really helped me connect with my mom and her family.
In the church, we talk a lot about integration and value diversity, but in practice, it's rarely ever there. So were there some aspects of that church that you were a part of in college that really drew out the diversity and integration in ways that are not so much practiced today?
That the church in college did not practice the type of integration that I think churches needed to do. It was a great start for me.
Yeah.
I'm in my 20s. I was just glad to be in a setting where I could interact with white people as human beings and as friends. And so that church was what I would call a racially mixed church. Okay. And that's good. And we need that. But there's a huge difference between a racially mixed church and an integrated church. And what I experienced later when I moved to Atlanta was an integrated church. And the difference is this: in a racially mixed church, black, white, and brown people share pews. In an integrated church, they share pews and they share power. That's the big difference. You can get a racially mixed church, particularly if you have like a mega church, like, for example, Charles Stanley just passed away. If you went to his mega church in Atlanta, you would see different types of racial people, and you say that's racially mixed. But a genuinely integrated church is something far more difficult to achieve. But I think that's the type of church that lasts. And I think it's actually the type of church that is more in keeping with the biblical example of the first century church that we have in the book of Acts.
Were there parts of your personal story that helped form this view of what it takes to build a really radically integrated church?
Yeah, because when I went to this what I would call a racially integrated church. That was decisive. That was like a breakthrough moment for me because, first of all, it also helped me understand the mystery because I had been to racially mixed churches before, but racially mixed churches are often, like I have found, to be like racially mixed neighborhoods. They don't last. You know why they don't last? It's the same reason why a lot of racially mixed neighborhoods don't last. Once the ratio of black or brown people gets past a certain point, white people leave. I mean, that's just the reality. That happens in neighborhoods and that happened in churches. That happened to a big racially mixed church I went to in Atlanta. It was a church, it was a big mega church, it was full of black and white people. And we all talked about, we're all one in Christ Jesus. But once the surrounding neighborhood changed, became pretty much predominantly black, all those white people left. This new church I went to was different. I mean, when I say talk about sharing power, the way you kind of keep these churches, make them work, is that it's not enough for just people to be in the pews. You have to you have to see your culture reflected. Like, are you only singing hymns that white people are comfortable with? When you look at on top of the pews, are the only people in charge white men? All these things. So in this church that I went to where I think we did it right, all those issues were addressed. All those things were talked about. And this is going to sound strange. There were a lot of arguments. There were a lot of debates. And that was healthy because we were talking about stuff. We were bringing it out in the open, and we weren't just like, just look at all the different people in the pews. So that was very helpful for me. That was a breakthrough.
How did they go about engaging in some of those debates and arguments? Because there's a real fear of even kind of addressing those for fear of coming off the wrong way. So did they have some guidelines around that?
You can have guidelines, but I think the most important thing is a reflection of the character of the leadership. These are kind of intangibles, and they had great leaders. First of all, the minister, when I was there, he was a white male. He didn't just see himself as a leader. He saw other people in the congregation as co-leaders. I mean, he was the type of guy, for example, when a black member challenged him for saying something that she thought was racist, that he listened and he admitted and confessed and adapted. So that was a reflection of his character. He was a man that had grown up in the Deep South, in the Jim Crow South. And he grew up believing that black people were subhuman. So he was wrestling with this stuff. So I think it's a reflection of the character. You have to have leadership that's willing to be criticized and to change. And I think also, they took seriously, like I said, the book of Acts. They took seriously what the Bible says about race. They took it seriously that these things should not prevent us from having a bond as human beings, so. But I think in the end, it's really reflection of the characters of the leaders.
Are you comfortable naming who the pastor was?
Yeah. Matter of fact, his name is Gibson Stroop, Stroupe. People call him Nibs. And this church that I went to in Atlanta is called Oakhurst Presbyterian Church. And it became a celebrity church because they did race right. It was featured in Time Magazine, National Public Radio, Christian Science Monitor. It was like this celebrity church because, like I said, it was so rare. And it just happened to be 15 minutes from where I lived. But I was just so blessed to experience that.
Yeah, it's really interesting how it's a similar experience for the Latino community when it comes to multicultural churches.
Yes.
Because like you said, it's all the white hymns,
Yes.
it's missing that Latin flavor where if it's just a Latino church, you're going to have salsa worship music,
Yes.
So a white church or a multicultural church can't compete with that. And it just kind of goes into this full circle of Sunday mornings, the most segregated time in America.
Yes. My wife is Latina. She's from Central America. She has complained about that. There's a tremendous amount of racism in the white church. Not just among the kind of typical villains we cite now, conservative Christians, but I'm talking about progressive Christians. And I give you an example what I'm talking about. We we went to a church, my wife, and she's from Guatemala, and I'm saying it wrong. I know it's all Americanized, but they they established a ministry for the church to serve people in Guatemala. My wife is a daughter of two missionaries from Guatemala. She grew up there, and they never even asked her to be part of the ministry. They just appointed a white male to be the leader, and this is a liberal progressive church. It wasn't conscious. They weren't aware of it. So I think that's the thing. A lot of progressive churches, they absorb a lot of these attitudes as well. Like, for example, if you're Latino, why can't you go to hear some of your language in the worship experience? Why can't you hear some of your song? You know, why you should see your culture reflected in a place that you attend.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because at a couple points in your book, you also bring up the existent racism practiced by people who proclaim to be advocates or allies. Can you name what a couple of those traits are? That underlying racism that maybe somebody of a progressive mindset might practice?
I mean, if I can understand the question, you mean like, what are some of the examples or
yes,
traits of progressive Christians acting in racist ways that they're not aware of?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for putting. Yeah. Hey, you're good at this. You ought to.
I've been wrestling with this stuff most of my life. No, I think like some of them I mentioned, like some of it is, look at the pews. Who's standing in the pulpit every Sunday? If it's only white men or only white people, you have a problem. I mean, particularly if you live in a mixed area. I mean, we're so segregated. So if you're a church in Iowa, I get it. But if you're in a large urban city, and you have people of color in the congregation, and your leadership is primarily pretty much all white, that's a problem. Look at the hymns you sing. They reflect other cultures. And I think also just how you deal with conflict. Is this a place where a person of color, brown or black person, will feel free to criticize people in leadership and bring their culture? I give you an example of how this racism works. My brother used to attend this interracial megachurch in Charlotte. You go there, it was like the United Nations. And they bragged about it from the pulpit. Oh, there's neither, black nor white. We're all one in Christ Jesus. But the worship style was very, I don't know how I want to say it, Eurocentric. And there used to be this black man who sat on the front row. And he was this large, dark, imposing, physically black man. And when the preacher would preach, he would get up and shout and go to the pulpit and urge him on. Now, that freaked white people out in the church. It didn't freak me out because I grew up in a black church tradition where there was call and response, where black people did that. But it freaked them out so much. Do you know what they did? They asked that man to leave the church. They couldn't deal. It was too unsettling to them because that was another culture's tradition, and they had to have their tradition be the dominant one. And this same church, when the whole George Floyd protest broke out, the white pastor didn't even address the racial justice issue, didn't talk about it, didn't wrestle with it. And most of those people of color left his church, and it's a shell of what it used to be. That's what I'm talking about. And this was we called a progressive church.
Yeah. Oftentimes it feels like it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that, where you say, well, that's not our people. And so we engage in these practices that feed back into that because we think, well, we're catering to who's here, and just keep catering to who's there.
Yeah, what you said, you cater to who's there. And I almost think, it's not even almost think, what's clear is that if the church is going to survive, they have to cater to people who are not there, who are not showing up. As I wrote a story a couple of weeks ago about the future of the church. And it's clear if this church is going to survive in this country, that they have to be able to attract non-white Christians, because that's all these non-white Christians who are who are living in the global South, in places like South America and Asia, they're coming to the United States. That's where the growth is. That's where the vitality is. If you want to remain relevant white church, you have to cater to them and make them feel welcome. And a lot of churches just don't know how to do it.
So shifting to the hope for the future, during Easter, you published an article precisely about hope for the future of the church. What inspired this hope?
Um, I think for me, what inspires the hope is like two things. What's happened to my family? Um, there's tremendous pessimism among Black people about whether white America could really change.
Mm.
And then there's tremendous pessimism, I think, among all Americans about whether we can really have a multiracial democracy and a multi-religious democracy that works. I mean, so many people feel like maybe human beings are too tribal to have this thing work. And I struggle with that in my job because I see some of the worst. But yet, I look at the people in my family, white members of my family, people call my father the N-word, violence against him. People didn't want anything to do with me, called me a zebra child and everything. And that we were able to come together and say, yes, we love one another, we're family. That's a tremendous source of hope. Because if people can change, a country can change. And the other source of hope I have is that the church already has the blueprint for this type of future. I say in a book that when I was in college and this man came to me, knocked on my dorm door and said, I want you to join my church to be a Christian. And he came and talked to me about Jesus, the cross, and salvation. None of that mattered to me. That didn't really have that much effect on me. But when I went to that church and I saw Black, white, and brown people hugging one another sincerely, being friends, going to each other's home, that had a tremendous impact on me. And to know that that came from the example of Jesus and the first Christians, Jesus, the one who would reach out to the centurion, to reach out to women, Samaritans, that is the thing that had an impact on me. So if we just tell our story and live our story, I think it will affect people.
In that moment when you were invited to participate in that first biracial church, you had a fence up about such scenarios because of your lived experience. So what do you feel like it was something supernatural that opened you up to participate in something like that? Or was there, or to find joy in even having those kinds of cross-cultural relationships?
There were a lot of different things. And I'm chuckling when you mentioned supernatural because that is one of the unusual aspects of my story. But to answer it, on one level, it was something that was totally not supernatural. It was just a day-to-day experience of living in a sustained, authentic relationship with people who are different. What happens is people stop being a category and they become individuals, So it's the boring, ordinary stuff, going to people's home, having dinner, seeing them as human beings, talking about your struggles, talking about your life. And that's the same thing that happened to my family. I mentioned my Aunt Mary, who didn't want anything to do with me. And I had tremendous hostility when I met her. This is my mother's sister. And I said that as we got to know each other, there was this point where she stopped being a white woman and became an individual, my Aunt Mary. So I think that sustained contact, that was the thing, nothing dramatic, just time, relationship, community, that changed me. And then, of course, there's an unusual element to my story that will be called supernatural that I can talk about if you want, but it might sound very strange, but that was also very pivotal.
Yeah. Well, let's go there. Let's hear the supernatural movement.
Yes.
Okay. So this is the strange part of my story. And I don't know if you came across this, Michelle. And I know sometimes as journalists, we don't really have time to, really read a book in depth or anything like that. But one of the things that happened to me as a kid is that, and this is with my brother, we had no contact with any white members of my family, like I said, until I was 17. In some ways, that's kind of true, but in some ways it's not true because when we were about like 7 or 8, we had an experience where my brother and I were, sleeping one night and we get a visitation. We wake up and we see a white man walking through our bedroom. And I thought I was hallucinating. My brother thought he was hallucinating. But when I awakened the next morning, there were footprints all over the floor. He left footprints. He left evidence that he had been there. And we could never figure out who this white man was. And then finally, when I met my mom years later, and I began to see pictures of her family, and we saw a picture of my mom's father, the one who hated black people, it was that man.
Oh.
And this man, now, so what do you do with something like that? You know what I did? I ignored it and lived my life. Because what can I do with anything like that? I didn't tell anybody about that. However, I couldn't ignore it because when I got married, well, let's put it this way. Usually when you get married, you tell people about your family, like, this is the uncle I want you to meet. Well, I didn't tell my wife that I had a relative that had visited me who wasn't alive. But what happened after we got married, she awakened in terror on 2 different occasions a night, saying, I'm waking up and I'm seeing this white man standing by the bed looking at you with this troubled expression on his face. And it was my grandfather. And part of my story is I had to figure out, what did he want from me? Why was what were these visitations about? And the thing I concluded is this. When we talk about racism, a lot of people will say racism hurts white people. And I believe that's true at least on one level. We talk about how, for example, poor white people will vote against their economic interests because of racism. However, I think racism hurts white people on another level. I think it's something that's destructive to the human soul. My white grandfather had tremendous racism in his life. He never bothered to have a relationship with me, and he died never knowing me. What I believe is that he was tormented by that, and he was felt guilty by that. And so what I said in the book is, in a way, he haunted me, but I haunted him. And the only thing that really stopped those visitations is when I consulted a minister, and he said, you have to pray for him and you have to forgive him from your heart. And when I did that, everything stopped.
Wow.
Thanks for sharing that story.
Yeah.
But that's the part of I didn't know whether to include that in the book. I had friends say, man, you don't want to go there. Don't put that there. But it was pivotal to me because you can't forgive anybody you don't know. So I had to get to know him. And this is crucial to me. I had to learn that you can't define a person by their worst act. Yes, my grandfather had rejected me. He had used the N-word, but there were these other sides of him that were good. And that, for example, when he died, the last person he called to say goodbye to was a black man who was one of his best friends. So I had to learn that these different things could coexist within people, that a white person could express racism and be racism, but they had other sides too, and that people could grow. And that was very difficult for me, but he compelled me to do so because I was like, what does he want? I had to get to know him. And that was very helpful for me.
Mm-hmm. I know. I'm glad you told that story because, and I get it again because of my Latino background. It's kind of what we were just talking about, where it is taboo. Not in in our cultures, it's not taboo, but
Correct.
in the wider white Christianity of the United States, we can't talk about that stuff.
Why is that?
Right, exactly.
I'm asking you, Michelle, what do you think?
I don't know. I've always struggled to figure out why. Because there's some stories and some things that I have to keep to myself because I'll just look crazy. But in my immediate community, it's like, it's just another Tuesday.
Yeah, and that's part of our culture. Like it is not a big thing, but you think about it. Look at the Bible; it's full of visitations, apparitions, miraculous signs. I mean, so why not this? So hey, it happened. I had to put it in there because it was core to me. It was core to me developing compassion and empathy for white people who express racism. Because when I see that, I see my grandfather, and I try to remind myself, people are more than their worst act.
Yeah. So, in the midst of this search, you were simultaneously dealing with the imposter Christianity, which I love that term, imposter Christianity. how were you able to still keep your faith and dealing with that as well?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because typical stories about biracial people, what they write is stories about the tug of war between their white and black identity. Like, I don't know if I'm white, I don't know if I'm black, I don't know where I belong. Okay, I experienced some of that. But the biggest struggle between my dueling identities occurred between my identity as a reporter and journalist and my identity as a just a private person. What I mean by that is that um, as a reporter, um, I've just seen the worst of racism in this country. And so I became very cynical and jaded. And when I write stories like, say, the Imposter Christianity, when I see how racism has just taken over so many white churches, it's so easy to like be cynical, to give up hope. So many black people are so distrustful of Christianity. That's why a lot of them become Muslims, because he's like, hey, y'all use the Bible to enslave us. But to answer your question, the thing that gives me hope is because I look at my family. I look at all these incredible white Christians I met on my journey, white evangelical Christians, the one, who helped me, who showed me that there was another side. And I know if they can change, others can change. So that's been a great example. One of the things I think I should mention is that what was key to me reconciling with my mother's family is that my mom and her family were devout Roman Catholics. So we both shared this Christian language.
Mm-hmm.
We both could talk about grace. We could both talk about forgiveness. Even though we couldn't see other things, that was this common place where we met. And when we met there, we could build from that and we could find a way to connect.
John, thank you so much for dedicating some time with us this morning. For folks who want to track along with what you're doing, you have a number of places where people can find you. Is there one specific spot online where people might get in touch with you or your writings?
Yeah, it's easy. I have a website, johnkblake.com, and you can contact me there. I'm on Facebook and Twitter. I'm easy to reach, and I know I'm easy to reach because I get hate mail. So they find me pretty easily, so you should be able to find me easily. So yeah, I'm pretty easy to get in contact with.
All right. And I've got one final question. It kind of comes out of left field, but
Sure.
On this podcast, we love to kind of highlight the strange and wonderful and surprising ways that the movement of God is happening in the world. And you've recently put up an article that talks about the monster culture in America. And
Yeah.
how might that send a message of hope for people who are seemingly, not getting together, not integrated, or feeling divided?
Well, it's funny. Okay, the monster culture. I think that is a out of the left field.
I just found it so compelling.
No,
I was like,
it's a good
oh.
question. It's a good question because I think it points to something I was reading today. And it's something I talk about in my book. Okay, so there's this conventional idea that the way you reduce racial prejudice is that you get, black, white, and brown people together to talk about race, diversity training, the national conversation of race. We've been having those conversations for a while. I don't think that's true. And I talk about it because social science backs that up. I talk about this person in my book called Gordon Allport, who was a psychologist in the 20th century. He was a giant. And he talks about something called contact theory. And he says, when you get different groups together to talk about race, that might work a little bit. But if you really want to get different groups together and reduce racial prejudice, you get them together where they have another larger common purpose beyond talking about race. I'll give you an example to make it less concrete. Remember movies like Remember the Titans? There are all these sports movies where people are divided by race. But once they join the same team, and they try to all go out for the championship, all those racial differences kind of, just melt away.
Yeah.
Because they have a larger purpose beyond talking about race all the time. And so that's a key thing, a key finding, I think, in reducing race. That if we want to reduce racism in this country, one of the best things we can do is get people together for a larger common purpose, for something other than race. And in doing so, they will see their common humanity. So, for example, monster culture, you mentioned that. There's a whole world of ghost hunters out there, whole subculture of, Bigfoot chasers and everything. When you get all these different races, people come together for that. They're not talking about race, but together for something larger. That's when the magic happens. That's when people start to see each other's common humanity. That's what happened when I became a Christian. I didn't go to those Bible studies to talk about racism, but me going there for a larger common purpose, to become a Christian or to learn about the gospel, I began to see the common humanity in people, and that really helped. And that's why a lot of people say one of the best ways we could probably reduce racism in this country if we had, like, say, a program for national service. Like, what if you had a program that kids out of college could volunteer for to clean up America, something to improve America, but you bring together people of all these races, religions, ethnicities. That's when people's racial attitudes change. So whether it's chasing monsters, whether it's, getting in a national service program, whether it's like joining a church, that's one of the keys I find.
Well, thanks for that perspective and for bearing with me on that.
No, that's right. I told you can ask anything you want.
All right, we have been disrupted by looking at faith in integration with John Blake.
Thanks for taking this walk with us. The Compass podcast is brought to you by United Methodist Communication. If Compass has been meaningful for you, then check out another episode.
I think episode 89 with Damon Garcia about radical Jesus is a great follow-up to this one. And episode 104, talking about saints with Joseph Yu, is full of more just kind of interesting stories. So while you're listening to those, leave a rating and or review.
Compass comes out every other Wednesday unless we are interrupted by a holiday, in which case we'll hit your feed the following week. But we'll be back online within 2 weeks' time in that case. Chat with you then. Peace.